The hospital gave my baby to another woman, but she refused to give him back. I'd been in labor for 32 hours when Oliver was finally born. My husband Matt held my hand the whole time. We cried when we heard him cry. The nurse showed him to us for exactly 10 seconds before saying he needed to go to the NICU for monitoring because his breathing was slightly fast. Standard procedure, they said. Matt went with him while they stitched me up. That's when everything went wrong. Matt got to the NICU, and they said Oliver was already there with his mother. Matt said he was the father. The nurse pointed to a woman holding a baby and said that was Oliver's mother, according to their charts. The woman was Diane. She'd given birth an hour after me. Matt tried explaining, but the nurse said he was confused and probably overwhelmed from becoming a father. She actually said fathers often got mixed up in the excitement. Security escorted Matt out when he wouldn't leave. He ran back to my room, panicking. I was still groggy from the epidural, but I knew something was wrong. We both went to the NICU, and I saw Diane holding my baby. I knew it was Oliver because he had Matt's birthmark on his shoulder. The exact same spot, exact same shape. The nurses said we were mistaken. The baby Diane was holding had her wristband number. The computer said he was hers. They brought us a different baby and said this was ours according to their system. But he didn't have the birthmark. He looked nothing like either of us. We demanded they check again. The head nurse said we were being difficult and threatened to call security if we didn't calm down. Diane sat there the whole time smirking. She'd heard us describe the birthmark and pulled the blanket higher to cover Oliver's shoulder. She said we were trying to steal her baby because ours was uglier. She actually said that. Called a newborn ugly to our faces. The hospital administrator came down and said they'd do a blood test to settle things, but it would take 3 days. In the meantime, the babies would stay with whoever had them currently for continuity of care. We had to take the wrong baby home. I couldn't even look at him. Not his fault, but he wasn't mine. I knew my body, I knew my baby, and this wasn't him. Matt stayed at the hospital watching Diane through the NICU window. She was breastfeeding Oliver, taking photos, posting on social media about her perfect son. She'd named him already, called him Christopher, put it on the birth certificate before we could stop her. The blood test came back. Oliver was definitely ours. The other baby was Diane's. We thought it would be simple then. Just switch them back. But Diane refused. She said she'd bonded with Christopher and it would be traumatic to separate them. She actually got a lawyer who filed an emergency custody petition claiming she was the psychological mother after 4 days. The hospital sided with her at first. They said it was their mistake, but now we needed to consider the best interests of the children. They suggested we keep the babies we'd been caring for to avoid disruption. The administrator said we could work out visitation with each other. Visitation with my own newborn son. I went nuclear. Called every news station in the state. But Diane had already posted her sob story online about strangers trying to take her baby. She'd left out the part about the blood tests proving Oliver was ours. Her post went viral. Thousands of people are calling us monsters for trying to steal a baby from a single mother. That's when I found out Diane's real story. She'd been trying to get pregnant for years. Multiple failed treatments. Her ex-husband left her over it. She'd used a sperm donor for this pregnancy and told everyone the father was a one-night stand. She'd specifically chosen a donor who looked like Matt. Same hair color, same build, same ethnic background. She'd been in the delivery room next to ours. She'd heard us talking about our families, our plans, Matt's good job. She'd heard everything. The nurses had made a legitimate mistake with the wristbands, but Diane knew immediately. She'd seen Matt's birthmark when he'd taken his shirt off in the hallway because he'd gotten blood on it. That's how she knew to look for it on Oliver. She wanted Oliver because he was the baby of a stable couple. She wanted the life we'd built. She admitted this to her sister in text messages. Her sister felt guilty and sent them to me. Diane had written that she deserved a baby from good genes, and Oliver was better than the baby she'd made with cheap sperm. She'd actually written that, called her biological son inferior goods. We got a court order for the switch, but Diane didn't show up. My cousin Rachel gave me Ava Reese's number the morning after Diane vanished. She practiced family law downtown and had a reputation for fighting dirty when clients needed it. I called from the hospital parking lot while Matt paced circles around our car with Christopher crying in his arms. Ava answered on the second ring and told me to come to her office immediately. She didn't ask for details over the phone. She just said to bring every document we had and she'd clear her afternoon. Her office was on the 3rd floor of a building near the courthouse. The walls were covered with framed certificates and photos of her shaking hands with judges. She looked younger than I expected, maybe 35, with dark hair pulled back so tight it made my scalp hurt just looking at it. She listened to our story without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad while Matt and I traded off explaining the wristband mix-up, the blood tests, Diane's refusal to comply with the court order. When we finished, she set down her pen and looked directly at me. She said Diane's refusal to show up for the court-ordered swap wasn't just contempt. It was parental kidnapping under state law. She explained we had multiple legal paths forward. including emergency custody enforcement and criminal charges for custodial interference. She pulled up the statute on her computer and showed us the language. Taking a child after DNA evidence proved he wasn't hers met every element of the crime. She said she'd file an emergency motion that afternoon for immediate custody enforcement with law enforcement assistance. Then she picked up her phone and called someone named Gary without explaining who he was first. Detective Gary Mathis arrived at Ava's office 40 minutes later, wearing jeans and a polo shirt like he'd been off duty when she called. He specialized in family abduction cases for the county sheriff's department. Ava had worked with him on 3 previous parental kidnapping investigations. He sat across from us and asked me to walk through the timeline again from the beginning. I told him about the NICU mix-up, about seeing Matt's birthmark on Oliver's shoulder, about Diane smirking while she covered it with the blanket. I told him about the blood tests and the court order and how Diane just didn't show up yesterday like she was supposed to. He wrote everything down in a small notebook, asking specific questions about what time things happened and who witnessed what. When I mentioned the text messages from Diane's sister, he stopped writing and looked up. He asked if we still had them. Matt pulled out his phone and showed him the screenshots. Gary read them twice, zooming in on the parts where Diane talked about deserving a baby from better genes. He said this was gold for proving intent. He explained that taking Oliver after the blood test results made it custodial interference at minimum. The premeditation shown in those texts could bump it to kidnapping charges depending on how the DA wanted to prosecute it. He said he'd open a criminal investigation immediately and coordinate with Ava on the family court side. He asked for Diane's full name, date of birth, last known address, vehicle information, phone number, and any social media accounts we knew about. Matt had most of it from the hospital records. Gary said he'd start by trying to locate her through her phone and credit cards, then move to checking with known associates if those didn't pan out. I fed Christopher a bottle while Gary and Ava talked about next steps. He latched onto the nipple and sucked hard, his tiny fingers curling around my thumb. The guilt hit me so hard I almost dropped him. This baby needed his mother even though she was a terrible person who'd stolen my son. He didn't ask to be born to someone who'd call him inferior goods in a text message. He didn't deserve to be the unwanted baby while she played house with Oliver. I looked down at his face and tried to feel something maternal, something that would make caring for him easier, but all I felt was this sick twist in my stomach. Every time I changed his diaper or rocked him to sleep, I thought about Diane doing those things for Oliver. Was she holding him right? Was she feeding him enough? Did she even know how to check if a diaper was too tight? Matt said something to Gary and I missed it completely because I was staring at Christopher wondering what kind of person I was that I couldn't bond with an innocent baby. The rational part of my brain knew it wasn't his fault. The rest of me just wanted him gone, so I could have my actual son back. Matt and I met with Lori Campbell the next morning at the hospital. She'd requested the meeting through her assistant, saying she wanted to discuss resolution options. We brought Ava with us. Lori's office was on the administrative floor with a view of the parking lot and a desk covered in framed photos of her kids. She stood up when we walked in but didn't come around the desk to shake hands. She looked like she hadn't slept, with dark circles under her eyes and her blazer wrinkled like she'd pulled it from a pile of laundry. She started talking before we even sat down, saying how sorry she was about the mix-up and how the hospital took full responsibility for the wristband error. Ava cut her off and said we weren't here to discuss apologies. Lori swallowed hard and nodded. She said the hospital wanted to offer a settlement to cover our legal costs and any other expenses related to getting Oliver back. She named a figure that made Matt's eyebrows go up. Ava wrote it down but didn't react. She asked what the hospital expected in return. Lori said they hoped we'd agree not to pursue a lawsuit once Oliver was safely home. She said the settlement would cover everything, including therapy costs and lost wages from time off work. Ava looked at me and Matt, then back at Lori. She said we'd consider it once Oliver was returned to us, but we weren't making any agreements while our son was still missing. Lori's face went pale. She asked if we planned to go to the media. Ava said that depended entirely on how cooperative the hospital was in helping locate Diane and correct their mistake. Lori promised full cooperation, and said she'd personally ensure all of Diane's employment records and contact information were provided to Detective Gary within the hour. Gary called Matt's phone 3 days later while I was trying to get Christopher down for a nap. Matt put it on speaker. Gary said he'd traced Diane's credit card to a motel 30 miles west of the city. She'd checked in 2 days ago under her own name and paid for a week in advance. Local police had done a drive-by and confirmed her car was in the parking lot. Gary said he'd coordinated with them to verify she was actually there with Oliver before making any moves. He explained they couldn't just knock on the door without risk of her fleeing or claiming she didn't have the baby. They needed visual confirmation first. He said he'd have an update within 24 hours once surveillance was complete. The relief that she hadn't fled the state made my knees weak. Matt had to grab my arm to steady me. But then Gary said she was refusing all contact from authorities. She wouldn't answer her phone or respond to messages from the police or the court. He said this was common in parental abduction cases where the taking parent believed they had a legitimate claim to the child. The delusion that Oliver was really hers had apparently survived the blood test results and court order. Gary said not to worry, that they had legal authority to take Oliver from her once they located her, but she was making it harder by avoiding contact. He told us to sit tight and wait for his call. The judge issued a warrant for Diane's arrest the following afternoon. Ava called to tell us and explained what it meant in practical terms. The warrant was for contempt of court and custodial interference based on her failure to appear for the court-ordered swap, and her continued possession of Oliver after DNA evidence proved he wasn't hers. This gave police the authority to physically enter wherever she was staying, arrest her, and take Oliver from her to return him to us. Ava said the warrant was critical because it removed any question about whether police could act. Before this, there was gray area about whether they could forcibly take a baby from someone without clear criminal charges. Now there was no gray area. The problem was Diane had checked out of the motel. Gary had called that morning to say surveillance showed her car leaving yesterday evening and she hadn't returned. The room was paid through the end of the week, but she was gone. He said they were checking her credit cards again and monitoring her phone, but so far she'd gone dark. No charges, no calls, no social media posts. She'd either ditched her cards and phone or she was smart enough to know they were tracking her. Ava said this was frustrating, but not hopeless. Most people couldn't stay off the grid for long, especially with a newborn. Diane would need to buy formula, diapers, baby supplies. She'd need gas for her car. She'd need to sleep somewhere. Eventually she'd surface and they'd find her. I sat in our bedroom that night with the breast pump attached to me, watching milk flow into the bottles while Matt slept in the guest room with Christopher. My breasts ached constantly now, engorged and heavy because my body didn't understand why my baby wasn't here to feed. The pump helped with the physical pain, but it felt wrong somehow, like I was preparing for something that might never happen. What if we didn't get Oliver back? What if Diane successfully disappeared with him, and I spent the rest of my life wondering where my son was? I pushed the thoughts away and focused on the steady rhythm of the pump. The freezer downstairs was filling up with bags of frozen milk, dozens of them now, all labeled with dates and times. Matt had bought a separate chest freezer just for the milk, because our regular freezer was full. I pumped every 3 hours around the clock, setting alarms to wake myself up at night. My body knew I had a baby who needed me even if that baby was missing. The physical pain of engorgement mirrored the way my chest felt tight and hollow at the same time, like something vital had been carved out, and I was just going through the motions until it could be put back. Diane's sister called my cell phone directly the next morning. I didn't recognize the number and almost didn't answer. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her at first. She said her name was Jennifer and she was so sorry for not coming forward sooner. She said she'd been terrified of Diane's reaction, of being cut off from the only family she had left, but she couldn't live with herself anymore knowing what Diane had done. She said she had more text messages, ones she hadn't sent before because they were worse than the first batch. I put her on speaker so Matt could hear. Jennifer said the text showed Diane had researched parental rights and psychological bonding arguments before Oliver was even born. She'd looked up cases where courts let adoptive parents keep babies after biological parents changed their minds. She'd studied arguments about the best interests of the child and how trauma from separation could be used to prevent custody changes. Jennifer sent screenshots while we were still on the phone. I opened them and felt sick. Diane had written to Jennifer 3 weeks before giving birth, saying she'd found the perfect donor who looked like a guy she'd seen at the fertility clinic. She'd written that if anything went wrong with her pregnancy, she had a backup plan. The messages from after the birth were even worse. Diane had texted Jennifer from the hospital saying the wristband mix-up was a gift from the universe. She'd written that she deserved this baby more than we did because she'd suffered more trying to have one. She'd actually written that suffering entitled her to steal someone else's child. Ava filed an emergency motion for full custody within an hour of receiving the new text messages. She said the evidence of premeditation was damning and completely destroyed any argument that Diane had a good faith belief Oliver was hers. The texts proved she knew from the start that Oliver wasn't her biological child, but decided to keep him anyway because she felt entitled to him. Ava explained this moved Diane's actions from delusional to calculated, which made her unfit as a parent not just to Oliver but potentially to Christopher as well. She filed for supervised visitation only if Diane ever regained custody of Christopher, arguing that her calculated theft demonstrated she couldn't be trusted with any child. Jennifer agreed to testify about Diane's mental state and planning. She said she'd tell the court everything, including conversations where Diane had talked about how unfair it was that people like us could have babies easily, while she'd suffered through years of failed treatments. Ava said Jennifer's testimony would be powerful because she was family, and had nothing to gain by turning on Diane. The judge scheduled an emergency hearing for the following week to address the new evidence and the custody motion. Matt hired a private investigator that afternoon after Gary called to say Diane's trail had gone cold. The investigator's name was Christian Reese, and he was Ava's brother. She'd recommended him after Gary admitted the police were stretched thin and couldn't dedicate unlimited resources to surveillance and tracking. Christian met us at a coffee shop near our house. He was older than Ava, maybe 40, with gray at his temples and the kind of calm voice that made you feel like everything would work out. He specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found, mostly for custody cases and debt collection. He said his success rate was over 90% because he understood how people thought when they were running. He asked detailed questions about Diane's life, her job, her friends, her habits, places she liked to go. Matt pulled up her social media and Christian scrolled through months of posts, taking notes about locations she'd checked into and people she'd tagged. He said most people had patterns they couldn't break even when they were trying to hide. They went to familiar places, contacted trusted people, fell back on comfortable routines. His job was to map Diane's patterns and predict where she'd go next. He said he'd start by identifying her social connections and likely hiding spots, then work outward from there. He charged $200 an hour plus expenses. Matt didn't even hesitate before agreeing. Christian left that morning with a photo of Diane and a list of her known contacts. He said he'd check in every 6 hours with updates. Matt went back to work because we needed the money for legal fees, and I stayed home with Christopher. The baby woke up at 5 crying for a bottle, and I heated formula while trying not to think about Oliver waking up somewhere without me. Christopher had an appointment with a pediatrician at 9, one Diane had scheduled 2 weeks ago before everything fell apart. I almost canceled it, but Ava said we needed to maintain medical care for him while this got sorted out. The office was in a strip mall next to a grocery store. I carried Christopher inside and gave the receptionist Diane's name. She looked at her computer and frowned. The doctor came out 20 minutes later, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes. She smiled at Christopher and asked where his mother was. I opened my mouth and nothing came out. How do you explain this to a stranger in 30 seconds? I told her Diane had my baby and I had hers and there was a court order, but Diane disappeared. The doctor's face changed. She looked at me like I was broken, like I was something sad she needed to fix. Christopher started crying and I bounced him automatically, even though every cell in my body wanted to put him down and walk away. The doctor examined him while I stood there feeling like a fraud. She asked if I was breastfeeding and I said no, he was on formula. She made notes in her chart. Christopher needed vaccines, but she wanted to wait until his custody situation was stable. She said it with such pity, I wanted to scream. I thanked her and left with Christopher still crying in my arms. Ava called while I was driving home. The hospital's legal team had reached out wanting to negotiate a confidentiality agreement. They'd pay our legal fees if we agreed not to talk to the media about the wristband mistake. Ava said she told them we weren't interested in protecting their reputation while Oliver was missing. I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. She said Lori was calling her office twice a day now, increasingly worried about the media attention. A local news station had started asking questions about hospital security after someone leaked parts of our story. Lori wanted it contained before it became a bigger scandal. Ava said that was their problem, not ours. Christian called at noon. He'd been mapping Diane's social connections and found a childhood friend named Rebecca, who lived 2 hours north. Diane had tagged her in old Facebook posts from years ago. Christian drove up there and parked down the street from Rebecca's house. He said he'd wait and watch. Matt came home early and took over with Christopher so I could pump. My breasts ached constantly from producing milk for a baby who wasn't there to drink it. I sat in the nursery we'd set up for Oliver and attached the pump and cried while the machine made its rhythmic sucking sound. The freezer was full of bags of milk now, dated and labeled, waiting for a baby who might never come home. Christian called again at 6. He'd been watching Rebecca's house for 6 hours and spotted Diane's car in the garage when Rebecca opened it to get something. He called Detective Mathis immediately. The detective said he'd coordinate with local police to execute the arrest warrant. Christian stayed in position to make sure Diane didn't leave. Matt and I waited by the phone. Every minute felt like an hour. I couldn't eat. Christopher needed a diaper change and I did it mechanically, my hands shaking the whole time. Detective Mathis called at 10 that night. They were planning to execute the warrant at dawn when Diane would be least likely to run. He said we should try to get some sleep because tomorrow would be a long day. Sleep was impossible. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Matt held my hand. Christopher slept in the bassinet next to us, the wrong baby in the wrong room. At 5 in the morning, my phone rang. It was Christian. Police were moving in now. The house was surrounded when officers knocked on the door. Rebecca answered in her bathrobe, looking confused. They showed her the warrant and pushed inside. Diane was in the back bedroom with Oliver. She refused to hand him over. Christian said she was screaming that they were ripping her baby from her arms, putting on a whole performance for Rebecca's doorbell camera. Officers were legally authorized to take Oliver because of the court order. One of them picked him up while 2 others restrained Diane. She fought them, still screaming about her rights and her baby. They carried Oliver out to a police car while Diane sobbed on the floor. Matt and I were already in the car racing north to the police station. Detective Mathis said they were bringing Oliver there for processing before releasing him to us. The drive took 90 minutes and I thought I'd lose my mind. Matt drove 10 miles over the speed limit the whole way. We pulled into the station parking lot and ran inside. Detective Mathis met us in the lobby and led us to a room where a female officer was holding Oliver. I took him from her arms and the world disappeared. He was thinner than 2 weeks ago, his face gaunt. I held him against my chest and sobbed so hard I couldn't breathe. Matt wrapped his arms around both of us. Oliver didn't cry. He just stared at me with these huge eyes like he wasn't sure who I was anymore. A pediatrician arrived to examine Oliver before we could take him home. The doctor was young, maybe 30, with a gentle voice. She laid Oliver on an exam table and checked him over while I stood there terrified of what she'd find. She said he'd lost weight, almost a pound since birth. He showed signs of dehydration because Diane had been struggling with formula feeding. His diaper rash was severe. The doctor said she wanted to admit him to the hospital for monitoring and IV fluids. My heart dropped. More time in a hospital, the place where this nightmare started. But Oliver needed medical care. The doctor said it would be 24 hours, maybe less if he responded well to treatment. They transferred us to the children's hospital an hour away. Oliver rode in an ambulance with a pediatric nurse while Matt and I followed in our car. The hospital admitted him to the pediatric unit and got him hooked up to an IV. I sat in a chair next to his bed and finally let myself fall apart. A nurse brought me tissues and water. She said I could stay with him as long as I wanted. I wasn't leaving. Matt went to get us food from the cafeteria. Detective Mathis called while we were settling in. Diane had been arrested and taken to county jail. Her bail hearing was scheduled for tomorrow morning. The judge would decide if she could be released pending trial. Detective Mathis said he'd recommend she be held without bail because she was a flight risk after evading the first court order. Her attorney was already making statements to the press about how Diane was protecting her psychological bond with Oliver. I told Detective Mathis I didn't care what her lawyer said. She stole my baby and nearly killed him through neglect. A lactation consultant came to the room that afternoon. She was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and warm hands. She said I could try breastfeeding Oliver now that he was stable. I was terrified he wouldn't remember how or wouldn't want to after 2 weeks of bottles. The consultant helped me position him and he latched immediately. The relief was overwhelming. My body had been waiting for this, producing milk for a baby who wasn't there. Now he was here and feeding, and the physical connection felt like reclaiming something Diane had stolen. Oliver nursed for 20 minutes before falling asleep. The consultant said we'd done great and she'd check back tomorrow. Detective Mathis called again that evening. Christopher had been placed in emergency foster care while Diane was in jail. Child Protective Services couldn't leave him with me because I wasn't his legal guardian, and Diane hadn't designated anyone else. The guilt hit like a truck. Christopher was an innocent baby now in the system because his mother committed a crime. I couldn't help feeling responsible even though logically I knew I wasn't. He'd been in my care for 2 weeks and now he was with strangers. Matt reminded me we'd done everything we could for Christopher. We'd fed him and changed him and kept him safe while his mother was stealing our son. But the guilt stayed. Detective Mathis wanted full statements from both of us about the entire timeline. He came to the hospital the next morning with a recorder and notebook. Matt and I walked him through everything from the initial wristband mistake to Diane's flight. He asked detailed questions about dates and times and exactly what Diane had said and done. He took notes about Oliver's birthmark and the blood test results and Diane's text messages to her sister. He said the district attorney was considering felony charges for custodial interference and child endangerment based on Oliver's dehydration and weight loss. The endangerment charge carried up to 5 years in prison. Detective Mathis said Diane's deliberate actions and Oliver's medical condition made this a strong case. I told him I wanted her prosecuted to the fullest extent. She'd stolen 2 weeks of my son's life and nearly killed him through incompetence. Ava came to the hospital the day after Oliver's recovery. She sat in the chair next to his bed and went through the legal steps we needed to take. She explained that getting Oliver back physically was just the first part. We needed family court to make everything official and permanent. She was filing a motion for full custody and a restraining order to keep Diane away from Oliver forever. The criminal case against Diane was separate from the family court proceedings. Even after Diane got convicted and went to prison, we still needed the custody order to protect Oliver legally. Ava said courts moved slowly, and we needed patience. I didn't feel patient. I wanted Oliver protected immediately. But I signed all the paperwork she brought and trusted her to handle the legal side while I focused on Oliver getting healthy. The hospital administrator came to see us that afternoon. Lori Campbell looked tired and worried. She said the hospital wanted to offer us a settlement to cover everything we'd been through. $200,000 for legal fees, therapy costs, and the wages Matt and I lost while fighting to get Oliver back. She said the money would be available immediately if we agreed to accept it. Ava was with us when Lori made the offer. She told us later that $200,000 was actually a good settlement. We could sue the hospital for more, but litigation would take years and cost a fortune in legal fees with no guarantee we'd win. The hospital made a mistake with the wristbands, but Diane was the one who deliberately kept Oliver. A jury might not blame the hospital enough to award us millions. Ava said we should take the money and use it for Oliver's future and our recovery. We needed to focus on healing as a family, not spending years in court battles. Matt and I talked about it that night while Oliver slept in his hospital bed. We decided to accept the settlement. The money wasn't the point. Getting Oliver back was the point. But the settlement would help us pay Ava and Christian and cover the therapy we were definitely going to need. We signed the agreement the next day. Oliver came home from the hospital 3 days later. The pediatrician said he was healthy enough to leave. His weight was back up and the dehydration was fixed. But I wasn't okay. Every time a nurse walked past Oliver's room, my chest got tight and I couldn't breathe right. When the discharge nurse came to go over Oliver's care instructions, I had to leave the room because I was shaking so hard. Matt noticed. He asked if I was okay and I lied and said I was fine. But I wasn't fine. I was scared all the time. Scared someone would take Oliver again. Scared I'd mess up and lose him. Scared of everyone in the hospital uniforms because they were the ones who gave him to Diane in the first place. Ava gave me the name of a therapist who worked with new mothers. Elise Howell specialized in postpartum trauma. I called her office the day after we got home and made an appointment for the following week. I didn't want to wait that long, but her schedule was full. When I finally sat in Elise's office, I cried for the first 20 minutes straight. She handed me tissues and didn't rush me. When I could finally talk, I told her everything. The hospital mistake, Diane stealing Oliver, the 2 weeks of hell, the panic attacks. Elise listened to all of it. Then she told me what I was experiencing had a name: parental kidnapping trauma. She said my hypervigilance and panic around medical staff were normal protective responses after what happened. My brain was trying to keep Oliver safe by seeing danger everywhere. She said we'd work on helping me feel safe again, but it would take time. I started seeing Elise twice a week. 3 weeks after we got Oliver back, Diane's preliminary hearing happened. Ava said I didn't have to go, but I wanted to be there. I needed to see Diane face consequences for what she did. Matt's mom came to watch Oliver so Matt and I could both attend. The courthouse was downtown, a big gray building with metal detectors at the entrance. We met Ava in the hallway outside the courtroom. She walked us through what would happen. The judge would hear the evidence and decide if there was enough to send Diane to trial. The district attorney would present the case. Diane's lawyer would try to defend her. We sat in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table. Diane came in wearing an orange jail jumpsuit with her hands cuffed in front of her. Her lawyer was a man named Brooks Shields. He looked expensive in his suit and tie. Diane sat next to him at the defense table. She didn't look at us. The judge came in and everyone stood. Then the hearing started. The prosecutor laid out the charges: felony custodial interference and child endangerment. He presented the blood test results proving Oliver was ours. He showed the court order Diane ignored. He had Detective Mathis testify about finding Diane at her friend's house with Oliver. He presented the medical records showing Oliver's weight loss and dehydration. Then Diane started crying. She sobbed into her hands while Brooks Shields talked about her years of infertility treatments and failed pregnancies. He painted her as a desperate woman driven by trauma and mental illness. He said she'd bonded with Oliver and couldn't bear to give him up. He made it sound like she was the victim. I wanted to scream. She wasn't the victim. We were. Oliver was. But I sat there silent while Brooks Shields talked about Diane's suffering. The judge listened to everything. Then he said there was enough evidence to bind Diane over for trial. She would face the felony charges in front of a jury. The district attorney offered a plea deal right there in court: 3 years in prison with 5 years of supervised probation after release. If Diane accepted the deal, she'd avoid trial and get a lighter sentence than she might get from a jury. Brooks Shields asked for time to discuss the offer with his client. The judge gave them 2 weeks to decide. Ava pulled us aside after the hearing. She asked if we wanted to provide a victim impact statement before Diane made her decision. If we wrote about how her actions affected us, the judge would consider it when deciding whether to accept any plea deal. I said yes immediately. I wanted Diane and her lawyer and the judge to know exactly what she put us through. I spent the next week writing the victim impact statement. It ended up being 10 pages long. I described every moment of agony from the second I realized Oliver was gone. The terror that I'd never see him again. The 2 weeks of caring for Christopher while my own baby was with a stranger. The weight I lost because I couldn't eat. The nightmares where Diane disappeared with Oliver and I couldn't find them. The way I couldn't bond with Christopher because he wasn't mine and I felt guilty about that. The panic attacks I still had. The way I checked Oliver constantly to make sure he was breathing, that he was really there, that no one had taken him. I wrote about Matt watching Diane through the NICU window while she fed our son and posted photos like he belonged to her. I wrote about the hospital telling us to just keep the wrong babies to avoid disruption. I wrote about the online mob calling us monsters for trying to get our own child back. I wrote about seeing Oliver in the hospital, thin and dehydrated because Diane couldn't properly care for him. I wrote about the ongoing trauma of not trusting anyone with my baby. When I finished, I gave it to Ava. She said it was powerful and would definitely impact the proceedings. 2 weeks later, Ava called with news. Diane rejected the plea deal. She was going to trial. Brooke Shields apparently convinced her that a jury would sympathize with her infertility struggle and mental health issues. He planned to argue diminished capacity. He'd claim Diane had a psychological break from years of fertility treatments and postpartum depression. He'd say she genuinely believed Oliver was hers despite the blood test. Ava said it was a risky strategy. The text messages to Diane's sister proved she knew Oliver wasn't hers. The messages where she called Christopher inferior goods would destroy any sympathy a jury might have. But Diane was betting on her sob story winning over the facts. The trial was scheduled for 4 months out. Ava said we needed to prepare for a long fight. Oliver was doing great at home. He was gaining weight every week. The pediatrician said he was hitting all his developmental milestones right on schedule. At his 2-month checkup, the doctor said there was no lasting physical damage from the 2 weeks with Diane. But I couldn't relax. I checked Oliver constantly, multiple times during every nap to make sure he was breathing. I watched him while he slept, counting his breaths, looking for any sign something was wrong. I knew I was being obsessive, but I couldn't stop. The fear that something would happen to him if I looked away for even a second was overwhelming. Elise said this was part of the trauma response. My brain was stuck in protection mode. We were working on it in therapy, but progress was slow. Matt went back to work after his family leave ended. His boss had been understanding about everything, but Matt couldn't stay home forever. That meant I was alone with Oliver for the first time during the day. The anxiety was suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone would break in and take him. I knew it was irrational. Diane was in jail. But the fear didn't care about logic. I called a locksmith and had him install extra locks on every door and window. Then I called a security company and had them set up a full system. Cameras on the front door, back door, and driveway. Motion sensors in every room. An alarm that would alert my phone if anyone approached the house. Matt thought I was going overboard, but he didn't try to stop me. He understood I needed to feel safe. The security system helped a little. At least I could check the cameras on my phone when Oliver was sleeping and confirm no one was outside. The social worker came for her home visit 2 weeks later. She was evaluating our environment as part of the custody proceedings. Even though Oliver was physically with us, the family court still needed to make everything official. The social worker's report would help the judge decide. Her name was Sandra, and she seemed nice. She walked through our house, looking at Oliver's nursery and asking questions about our daily routine. Then she sat with us in the living room and watched me feed Oliver. She asked about his eating and sleeping patterns. She asked about our support system and whether we had family nearby. She played with Oliver for a few minutes, holding him and talking to him in a soft voice. Oliver smiled at her. He was starting to smile at everyone now, his personality emerging. Sandra wrote notes in her folder the whole time. Before she left, she told us Oliver seemed very attached to us. She said he showed secure attachment behaviors and was developing appropriately. She'd recommend in her report that we retain full custody. The relief was enormous. One more piece of legal protection for Oliver. A week after Sandra's visit, I got a call from the social worker handling Christopher's case. She said the foster family who'd been caring for him wanted to adopt him. They knew his whole story. They knew about Diane, about what she'd done, about how she'd called him inferior goods. They wanted him anyway. They wanted to give him a permanent home with parents who chose him instead of leaving him in the system because his mother was in jail. The relief hit me hard. I'd been carrying guilt about Christopher since the day we got Oliver back. He was an innocent baby who'd been rejected by his biological mother, and I'd been the one forced to care for him while desperate for my own son. Now he'd have a family who actually wanted him. The social worker said the adoption would be finalized within a few months. Christopher would have a new name, a new life, and parents who'd love him without comparing him to some imaginary better baby. I thanked her and hung up. Then I cried for 20 minutes straight. Relief and guilt mixed together until I couldn't tell which emotion was which. Matt found me in the kitchen holding Oliver and sobbing. He wrapped his arms around both of us. He said Christopher was going to be okay, and we'd done everything we could for him. I wanted to believe that. 3 days later, Ava called with news about the criminal trial. The date was set for 4 months out. She walked me through what would happen. We'd both need to testify about the timeline, about discovering Oliver was gone, about the blood test results, about Diane's refusal to return him. The prosecutor would show the jury those text messages to Diane's sister, the ones where she talked about deserving a baby from better genes. Ava said those messages were the strongest evidence we had. They proved Diane knew Oliver wasn't hers and kept him anyway. I asked if we'd have to face Diane in court. Ava said yes. She'd be sitting at the defense table the whole time. I'd have to look at her while I testified. The thought made me sick. I didn't want to see her face again. Didn't want to hear her voice or watch her cry her fake tears for the jury. But Ava said it was important. The jury needed to hear from us directly. They needed to understand what Diane had done to our family. I agreed because I wanted justice. I wanted the jury to know exactly what those 2 weeks without Oliver had cost us. The hospital sent a letter a week later. It came in a thick envelope with the hospital logo on the front. Inside was a 3-page letter from Lori Campbell explaining all the new security protocols they were putting in place. Mandatory ID verification before any baby could be moved from one location to another. Electronic wristband systems that would alert staff immediately if the bands didn't match the mother's information. Additional training for all maternity ward staff on proper identification procedures. Video monitoring in the NICU with recordings kept for 30 days. The letter went on and on about how seriously they were taking patient safety. How they'd learned from their mistakes. How they were committed to making sure nothing like this ever happened again. I read it twice and then threw it in the trash. New protocols didn't change what had happened to us. They didn't give me back the 2 weeks I'd lost with Oliver. They didn't erase the trauma of watching Diane hold my baby while I was forced to care for hers. The hospital was covering their ass. That's all the letter was. Legal protection disguised as concern. Matt fished the letter out of the trash later and filed it with our other documents. He said we might need it for the lawsuit. I didn't care. No amount of policy changes would fix what they'd broken. I found a support group for parents who'd experienced custody disputes or parental kidnapping. Elise had recommended it during one of our therapy sessions. She said talking to other people who'd been through similar trauma might help me feel less alone. The group met every Tuesday evening at a community center downtown. Matt stayed home with Oliver while I went to the first meeting. There were 8 other parents there. The facilitator asked everyone to share their story if they felt comfortable. One woman's ex-husband had taken their daughter to another country for 6 months. She'd spent that entire time working with international lawyers and law enforcement to get her back. She talked about the fear of not knowing if she'd ever see her daughter again. About the rage at a system that let him cross borders with a child he had no legal right to take. About the relief when her daughter was finally returned, and the ongoing trauma of knowing it could happen again. Another man's sister had kidnapped his son during a supervised visit and disappeared for 3 weeks. A woman's mother-in-law had taken her newborn twins, claiming the mother was unfit. Each story was different, but the core was the same. Someone had taken their child. The system had failed to protect them. They'd fought to get their kids back. I shared our story when it was my turn. I talked about the wristband mix-up, about Diane refusing to return Oliver after the blood test, about the 2 weeks of hell before police brought him home. The other parents nodded. They understood. When the meeting ended, the woman whose ex had taken her daughter to another country came up to me. She said it gets easier, but it never goes away completely. The fear stays with you. But you learn to live with it. You learn to trust again, slowly. Her words helped more than any therapy session had. She'd survived something worse and made it through. If she could do it, maybe I could too. Oliver turned 3 months old on a Tuesday. Matt took the day off work and we celebrated at home, just the 3 of us. Oliver was smiling now. Real social smiles, not just gas. He'd coo and make noises when we talked to him. He'd grab at toys and track movement with his eyes. Every milestone felt like a miracle. The pediatrician said he was developing perfectly. No delays, no concerns. But the joy was complicated. Every smile reminded me of the newborn smiles I'd missed. Every coo made me think about those first 2 weeks when Diane had him and I didn't. She'd been there for his first real smile. She'd heard his first coos. She'd stolen those moments from us and we could never get them back. Matt understood without me having to explain. He'd take photos of Oliver doing something new, and I'd see the same mix of happiness and sadness on his face. We were grateful to have him home. We loved him completely. But Diane had taken something from us that no court order could return. She'd stolen time we could never recover. Those first weeks of bonding that were supposed to be ours. She'd inserted herself into our son's earliest memories even though she had no right to be there. I tried to focus on the present. On the fact that Oliver was here now, healthy and happy and ours. But the loss of those 2 weeks haunted me. 2 weeks after Oliver's 3-month milestone, Ava called with unexpected news. Diane wanted to negotiate a settlement in the family court case. She was offering to give up all parental rights to Oliver in exchange for us not pursuing additional civil damages beyond the hospital settlement. Ava said it was a good deal. It would mean permanent legal protection for Oliver. Diane would have no claim to him ever. No visitation rights, no custody rights, nothing. She'd be legally severed from our son forever. I didn't even hesitate. I said yes immediately. Matt agreed when I told him. We'd already accepted the hospital settlement. We didn't need more money. We needed Oliver to be legally and permanently ours with no possibility of Diane ever coming back. Ava filed the paperwork that afternoon. Within a week, the judge signed the order. Diane had officially given up all parental rights. Oliver was ours. Not just physically, but legally. She couldn't change her mind. Couldn't file for visitation later. Couldn't claim any connection to him. The relief was staggering. One less thing to worry about. One less way Diane could hurt us. The criminal trial started on a Monday morning in October. Matt and I arrived at the courthouse an hour early. Ava met us outside and walked us through what would happen. The prosecutor would call me first to establish the timeline, then Matthew. Then they'd present the physical evidence and the text messages. I sat in the hallway waiting to be called, my stomach twisting into knots. When the bailiff finally called my name, I walked into the courtroom and saw Diane sitting at the defense table. She looked smaller than I remembered, thinner. Her lawyer, Brooke Shields, sat next to her taking notes. The prosecutor asked me to describe what happened after Oliver was born. I told the jury about Matt going to the NICU and finding Diane holding our baby, about the nurses refusing to believe us, about the blood test that proved Oliver was ours, about Diane's refusal to return him even after the results came back. My voice stayed steady until I described the moment police finally brought Oliver home. Then it cracked. The prosecutor showed me the text messages Diane had sent to her sister. The ones where she said she deserved a baby from better genes, where she called Christopher inferior goods, where she admitted Oliver was better than her biological son. I confirmed they were the messages her sister had forwarded to me. Several jurors looked at Diane with open disgust. One woman in the back row shook her head. The prosecutor thanked me and I stepped down. I didn't look at Diane as I walked past the defense table. Diane took the stand the next day. Brooke Shields had her dressed in a plain blue dress with minimal makeup. She looked vulnerable, sympathetic. She cried while describing her fertility struggles, the failed treatments, the marriage that ended because she couldn't get pregnant, the years of wanting a baby and being denied. She talked about how desperate she'd been, how she'd used a sperm donor as a last resort, how when Oliver was born and the hospital said he was hers, she'd believed it because she wanted it to be true. She claimed she'd genuinely thought Oliver was her son, that she'd bonded with him immediately, that the blood test results hadn't made sense to her because she felt like his mother. Brooke Shields asked if she'd been in her right mind during those 2 weeks. Diane said no. She said she'd been suffering from postpartum depression and the psychological trauma of years of infertility. She said she hadn't been thinking clearly. She said she'd had a psychological break. The prosecutor stood up for cross-examination. He asked Diane about the text messages to her sister, the ones where she said Oliver was better than Christopher, where she admitted she knew about Matt's birthmark before Oliver was born, where she talked about deserving a baby from good genes. Diane tried to explain them away. She said she'd been confused, that she'd written things she didn't mean, but the messages were clear. They showed planning. They showed intent. They showed she knew exactly what she was doing. The jury wasn't buying her psychological break defense. I could see it on their faces. Matt testified after Diane. The prosecutor asked him to describe watching Diane in the NICU. Matt's voice was calm at first. He explained how he'd stood outside the window watching her hold Oliver, how she'd smirked at him, how she'd posted photos on social media while we were desperate to get our son back. Then the prosecutor asked about the moment police returned Oliver. Matt's voice broke. He described holding our son again after 2 weeks, the relief and terror mixed together, the fear that Oliver wouldn't remember us, that those 2 weeks had damaged something we couldn't fix. He talked about Oliver's weight loss and dehydration, about the hospital admission because Diane hadn't been feeding him properly. Several jurors were crying. One man in the front row wiped his eyes. The jury was clearly on our side. They understood what Diane had done. They saw through her tears and excuses. When Matt stepped down, I felt something shift in the courtroom. The momentum was ours. The jury got the case late on a Thursday afternoon. They deliberated for 6 hours. Matt and I waited in a conference room with Ava. Every hour that passed felt like a week. Finally, at 8:30 that night, the bailiff came to get us. The jury had reached a verdict. We filed back into the courtroom. Diane sat at the defense table staring straight ahead. The judge asked the jury foreman to read the verdict. Guilty on count 1, felony custodial interference. Guilty on count 2, child endangerment. The courtroom erupted. Someone behind us gasped. Diane started crying. Brooke Shields put his hand on her shoulder. The judge banged his gavel and called for order. Then he thanked the jury and dismissed them. Sentencing would be scheduled for 3 weeks out. We left the courthouse in a daze. Matt held my hand so tight it hurt. Ava said the conviction meant Diane would face prison time. Real consequences for what she'd done. More importantly, it validated that her actions were criminal. Not a custody dispute. Not a misunderstanding. A crime. She'd stolen our baby and the law had finally recognized it. The sentencing hearing was 3 weeks after the verdict. Matt and I sat in the front row behind the prosecutor's table. Diane sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit. Her hands were cuffed in front of her. Brooke sat next to her shuffling papers. The judge entered and everyone stood. He sat down and told us to be seated. The prosecutor stood first and recommended 4 years in prison plus 5 years supervised probation. He talked about the premeditation shown in the text messages. The deliberate choice to keep Oliver after knowing the blood tests proved he wasn't hers. The endangerment from improper feeding that led to his hospitalization. Brooke stood next and argued for probation only. He said Diane had no criminal history, that she'd suffered from postpartum depression and infertility trauma. That prison wouldn't serve any rehabilitative purpose. The judge looked at me and asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement. I stood up. My hands were shaking so hard the papers rattled. I walked to the podium and started reading. I described the moment Matt ran back to my room panicking because they wouldn't let him see Oliver. The terror of seeing Diane holding my baby and knowing something was wrong. The nightmare of taking Christopher home while Oliver stayed with her. Watching her post photos on social media while we begged for our son back. The 2 weeks of separation that felt like years. Finding out she'd chosen a sperm donor who looked like Matt because she wanted our life. Reading her texts about Oliver being better than Christopher, better genes, superior goods. My voice broke when I talked about Oliver's weight loss and dehydration. How she'd endangered him because she didn't know how to care for him properly. How we'd almost lost him twice. Once to her theft and once to her neglect. I looked at Diane while I read. She stared at the table, never looked up once, never made eye contact. The judge thanked me and I sat down. He took 10 minutes to review his notes. Then he looked at Diane and told her to stand. He said her actions went beyond a custody dispute. That she'd deliberately kept a child she knew wasn't hers. That she'd endangered that child through improper care. That she'd caused severe emotional trauma to his biological parents. He sentenced her to 4 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. He issued a permanent restraining order preventing any contact with Oliver or our family. Diane started crying. Brooks put his hand on her shoulder. The bailiff led her away through the side door. She never looked at us. We left the courthouse in silence. Matt held my hand in the parking lot. Ava walked with us to our car. She said the sentence was fair given the circumstances, that the restraining order meant Diane could never hurt us again. We thanked her for everything. She hugged me and said she was glad Oliver was home safe. Matt and I sat in the car for 20 minutes before driving home. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the exhaustion. We'd won. Oliver was legally and permanently ours. Diane would spend 4 years in prison for what she did. But the trauma didn't just disappear because justice was served. I still woke up at night checking Oliver's crib. Still felt panic when strangers looked at him too long. Still had nightmares about Diane taking him again. Matt drove us home and we picked up Oliver from my mom's house. He was 4 months old now, smiling and cooing and perfect. I held him tight and cried into his soft hair. My mom asked how it went and Matt told her about the sentence. She hugged us both and said she was proud of us for fighting so hard. We took Oliver home and I fed him while Matt made dinner. Normal evening routine, normal family moment. But nothing felt completely normal anymore. I had therapy with Elise the next week. She asked how I was feeling after the sentencing. I told her about the relief mixed with exhaustion, the sense that we'd won but also lost something we could never get back. Those first 2 weeks with Oliver, the ease of trusting hospitals and systems, the belief that bad things wouldn't happen to us. Elise said trauma changes how we see the world, that my hypervigilance was a normal response to what happened. We talked about Christopher, the guilt I still carried about caring for him while desperate for Oliver. Elise said I'd done the best I could in an impossible situation. That Christopher wasn't my responsibility, but I'd cared for him anyway. That his adoption meant he was safe and loved with a family who chose him. She asked if I'd thought about what I wanted moving forward. I said I wanted to help other families, to make sure what happened to us didn't happen to anyone else. She said that was a healthy way to process trauma, turning pain into purpose, making meaning from suffering. I left her office feeling lighter than I had in months. Matt and I met with our financial advisor the following week. The hospital settlement had been deposited into our account. $200,000. It felt wrong somehow, like they were paying us to forget what happened. But we needed it. Legal fees had drained our savings. Matt had used all his family leave. I hadn't been able to work since Oliver was born. We decided to put half into a college fund for Oliver. The other half would cover our expenses while I stayed home with him another year. Then Matt suggested something. He wanted to donate $50,000 to an organization that provided legal help to parents in custody disputes. Families who couldn't afford lawyers like Ava, who were fighting for their kids without resources. I loved the idea immediately. Turning our nightmare into something that helped others felt meaningful. We researched organizations and found one that specialized in parental rights cases. We made the donation in Oliver's name. The director called us personally to thank us. She said the money would help at least 10 families get legal representation. 10 families who might get their kids back because we shared our settlement. It didn't erase what happened to us, but it helped. The hospital fired 3 staff members 2 months after the settlement. The nurses who'd mixed up the wristbands and the supervisor who hadn't caught the mistake. Lori resigned under pressure from the board. The news mentioned an internal investigation and systemic failures in their security protocols. A new administrator was appointed. She contacted us through Ava asking if we'd meet with her. We agreed reluctantly. She came to our house on a Tuesday afternoon. Her name was Gail Porter. She apologized personally for what happened, said she'd reviewed every detail of our case, that the hospital had implemented new systems to prevent similar mistakes. Electronic wristbands that matched babies to mothers automatically. Mandatory ID verification before any baby was moved. Additional training for all maternity staff. She showed us documentation of the changes, asked if we had suggestions for other improvements. Matt asked about the response time when parents reported concerns. Gail said they'd created a direct escalation protocol. Any parent questioning their baby's identity would trigger immediate DNA testing. No more 3-day waits. No more dismissing worried parents as confused. She thanked us for meeting with her and left her card. Said we could call any time if we needed anything. It felt too little too late but necessary. At least other families might be safer. Oliver's 6-month checkup was in late summer. The pediatrician examined him thoroughly, measured his height and weight, checked his reflexes and responses. She said he was developing normally. No signs that the early disruption affected his attachment or growth. His weight was in the 70th percentile. His motor skills were right on track. She asked about his sleep and feeding. I told her he was sleeping through most nights now, eating solid foods mixed with breast milk. She smiled and said he was thriving, that we were doing everything right. The medical reassurance helped, but I knew the emotional impact would take longer to heal. Oliver didn't remember those 2 weeks with Diane. He was too young, but Matt and I would never forget. The trauma lived in our bodies. In the way I checked his breathing multiple times every night. In the way Matt photographed every milestone obsessively. In the way we both tensed when anyone in scrubs came near our son. The pediatrician said those responses would fade with time. That therapy would help us process what happened. I wanted to believe her. I started writing a blog in September, not using real names but sharing our story. I wanted to help other parents navigate hospital mistakes and custody nightmares. I wrote about the initial mix-up and how we knew immediately something was wrong. About the blood tests and Diane's refusal to return Oliver. About the legal battle and the criminal charges. About the trauma of separation and the long recovery. I posted it on a parenting forum first. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of comments from families who'd experienced similar situations. Medical errors with newborns, custody disputes with family members, legal battles that dragged on for months. Parents reached out privately asking for advice, wanting to know which lawyers we used, how we proved our case, what helped us cope with the trauma. I answered every message, connected families with resources, shared Ava's contact information for those in our state. The blog became something bigger than I expected. A community of parents supporting each other through impossible situations. Turning our worst experience into something that helped others made the pain feel purposeful. Matt and I were invited to speak at a hospital safety conference in October. The conference focused on patient advocacy and error prevention. They wanted us to share our experience from the family perspective. We debated whether to do it, whether reliving the trauma publicly was worth it. But the conference organizers said our story could change hospital policies nationwide. That other institutions needed to hear directly from families affected by medical errors. We agreed to speak. The conference was downtown in a huge hotel ballroom. Hundreds of hospital administrators and safety officers filled the seats. Matt and I stood on stage with microphones. I talked about discovering Oliver was gone, about the hospital's initial dismissal of our concerns, about the 3-day wait for blood tests while Diane bonded with our baby. Matt talked about watching helplessly through the NICU window, about being escorted out by security when he insisted Oliver was ours, about the systemic failures that let Diane keep our son for 2 weeks after the blood tests proved the truth. We talked about what immediate error correction could have prevented, how taking our concerns seriously from the start would have stopped everything. The audience was silent. Several people were crying. After we finished, the moderator opened the floor for questions. Administrator after administrator stood up asking about our recommendations. We talked about electronic verification systems, about escalation protocols for parental concerns, about the importance of believing families who knew something was wrong. Standing on that stage felt empowering, like we were taking back control of the narrative Diane tried to steal, turning our nightmare into systemic change that would protect other families. Diane's sister reached out again in November. She sent a message through Ava asking if she could send a gift for Oliver, something for his first Christmas. We discussed it carefully. Part of me wanted to maintain complete separation from anyone connected to Diane. But her sister had been brave. She'd come forward with the text messages that proved Diane's intent. Without that evidence, the case would have been much harder. We told Ava to thank her for her courage but decline the gift. That we appreciated what she'd done but needed distance from that part of our lives. Ava passed along the message. The sister responded saying she understood. That she hoped Oliver was happy and healthy. That she was sorry for everything her sister had done. I felt sad reading it. She'd lost her relationship with Diane over this. Done the right thing knowing it would destroy her family. But I couldn't let her into our lives. Couldn't risk any connection to Diane even through her sister. Some bridges had to stay burned. I realized something in December. I'd slept through the entire night for the first time since Oliver was born. Didn't wake up at 2 a.m. to check his breathing. Didn't jolt awake in panic that someone had taken him. Matt noticed too. Asked if I'd had nightmares. I said no. Just normal sleep. Normal new parent exhaustion from Oliver waking up once for a bottle. The hypervigilance was fading slowly, replaced by regular tiredness instead of trauma-driven insomnia. It felt like progress. Real healing instead of just surviving. Oliver was 7 months old, sitting up on his own, eating mashed vegetables, laughing at peekaboo, normal baby doing normal things. Our family was finding its rhythm. The trauma would always be part of our story, but it wasn't defining every moment anymore. We were learning to live with what happened instead of being consumed by it. The letter came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail. Matt signed for it while I was feeding Oliver mashed bananas. He opened it at the kitchen table and his face went pale. I asked what was wrong and he slid the paper across to me. Diane was appealing her conviction. Her new lawyer claimed Brooks had provided ineffective counsel by not pursuing a diminished capacity defense based on postpartum depression and infertility trauma. The appeal argued the jury should have heard expert testimony about her mental state. I felt my stomach drop reading the legal language. Matt called Ava immediately and she picked up on the second ring. She listened to him read the notice and then told us to come to her office that afternoon. We brought Oliver with us because I couldn't leave him with anyone yet. Ava explained that appeals were common but rarely successful, especially with evidence as strong as ours. The text messages to Diane's sister proved premeditation. The blood tests proved Oliver was ours. The hospital records showed she knew the truth and kept him anyway. Ava said the appellate court would review the trial record and legal arguments, not retry the case. They would only overturn the conviction if they found serious legal errors that affected the outcome. She estimated maybe a 5% chance of success. But that 5% chance was enough to make my hands shake. The thought of Diane getting out, getting another trial, potentially getting access to Oliver again made me sick. Matt held my hand while Ava talked us through the timeline. The appeal would take months to process. We would be notified of any hearings. We could submit our own response through the prosecutor's office. For now, we just had to wait. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking Oliver's crib every 20 minutes to make sure he was still there. Matt found me at 3 a.m, standing over Oliver's sleeping form, and guided me back to bed. He reminded me that Diane was in prison, that she couldn't hurt us anymore, that the appeal was just a formality. I wanted to believe him, but the fear was physical, a weight in my chest. Oliver started eating solid foods at 6 months, and every meal felt like a gift. I pured vegetables and mixed rice cereal and watched him smear sweet potatoes across his face. Matt took photos of everything. Oliver's first bite of avocado. Oliver making a disgusted face at peas. Oliver reaching for the spoon and grabbing my hand instead. We had hundreds of photos on our phones already, but Matt kept taking more. He said we missed 2 weeks of Oliver's life and he wasn't going to miss anything else. I understood completely. Every smile, every new sound, every tiny development felt precious, because we knew how close we came to losing all of it. When Oliver laughed for the first time, a real belly laugh at Matt making silly faces, we both cried. Happy tears this time, not trauma tears. The pediatrician said Oliver was developing perfectly, hitting all his milestones right on schedule. No lasting effects from those 2 weeks with Diane. But I still worried. I watched him constantly for signs of something wrong, some delayed reaction to being separated from us so early. Elise said the hypervigilance was normal, that it would fade as Oliver got older and I felt more secure. For now, I just had to sit with the anxiety and not let it control my life. The appeal decision came 3 months later. Ava called me at home and I could hear the relief in her voice before she even said the words. Denied. The appellate court upheld Diane's conviction and sentence in a brief written opinion. They found no legal errors in the trial, no basis for the ineffective counsel claim. The evidence was overwhelming and the jury verdict was sound. Diane had exhausted her direct appeal rights. She could still file other motions later, but those had even lower success rates. For practical purposes, it was over. She would serve her full 4-year sentence. I sat down on the floor when Ava told me. Just dropped right there in the kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear. Matt took Oliver from my arms because I was shaking too hard to hold him safely. The finality of it hit me like a wave. Diane couldn't hurt us anymore. Couldn't take Oliver. Couldn't disrupt our lives with more legal battles. She was locked away and would stay locked away. When Matt hung up the phone, I started crying. Relief crying. The kind that comes from your whole body. He sat down next to me and we held each other while Oliver played with blocks on the floor beside us. After months of fear and stress and waiting, we finally had closure. Real closure, not just hoping things would work out. The legal system had worked. Justice had been served. Diane would face consequences for what she did. That night, I slept through until morning without checking Oliver's crib once. A letter arrived 2 weeks after the appeal decision, an official-looking envelope with a state seal. Inside was an invitation to testify before the state legislative committee reviewing hospital security protocols and custodial interference laws. They were considering new legislation and wanted to hear from families affected by hospital mistakes and parental kidnapping. The committee chair had read about our case in the news coverage and thought our experience could inform policy changes. I showed Matt the letter and he said I should do it. That sharing Oliver's story with lawmakers could prevent other families from going through what we did. I was nervous about speaking publicly, but also excited. This felt important. Like the final step in transforming our nightmare into something that could help people. I called the number on the letter and confirmed I would testify. They scheduled me for a hearing in 6 weeks. I started preparing what I wanted to say. Not just our story, but specific recommendations. Immediate blood testing when parents disputed baby identity. Electronic verification systems that couldn't be overridden by human error. Escalation protocols for parental concerns. Legal consequences for hospitals that dismissed families. I worked on my testimony every night after Oliver went to bed. Matt helped me organize my thoughts and practice delivery. We wanted the committee to understand not just what happened, but how systemic changes could prevent it. The hearing date approached and I got more nervous. But I knew this mattered. That speaking up was how we made sure Oliver's story meant something beyond just our family. Matt came home from work one evening with news. His boss had offered him a promotion to senior project manager. Better title, significant raise, more responsibility. He would be managing a larger team and overseeing bigger projects. The promotion meant financial stability we hadn't had before. I could stay home with Oliver longer before going back to my job. We could afford a bigger house eventually, save for Oliver's college, not stress about money while I was still processing trauma. Matt was excited but also worried about the extra hours. I told him to take it, that we would figure out the schedule, that this was good news, something positive after months of stress. He accepted the promotion the next day. His new salary meant I could take another year of parental leave if I wanted. The security of knowing we could provide for Oliver without financial pressure felt like another piece of normalcy returning. Like we were building the stable life Diane had tried to steal. That weekend we celebrated with dinner out, just the three of us. Oliver sat in a high chair at the restaurant and grabbed at everything on the table. Normal family doing normal things. The kind of life we'd dreamed about during those dark weeks when we thought we might never get Oliver back. Oliver turned 11 months old on a Tuesday. Matt and I were sitting on the living room floor playing with him when he pulled himself up on the coffee table. He'd been doing that for weeks, standing while holding furniture. But this time he let go. He stood there for 3 seconds, wobbling, and then took a step. Then another step. Then he fell on his butt and looked surprised. Matt and I both screamed. Happy screaming, the kind that makes babies laugh. Oliver got back up and tried again. 4 steps this time before falling. We scooped him up and hugged him and called everyone we knew. Our baby was walking. Such a normal milestone that felt extraordinary because we'd fought so hard to be here for it. I thought about Diane in prison, missing Christopher's milestones because she'd been so obsessed with stealing ours. I felt sad for a second, thinking about Christopher growing up without his mother. But then I remembered what she'd done. How she'd called him inferior goods. How she'd chosen to commit a crime instead of loving the baby she had. She'd made her choices, and now she lived with the consequences. That night, Matt and I watched videos of Oliver's first steps over and over. Every milestone felt precious and hard-won. A reminder that we'd fought for him and won. That he was ours forever, legally and permanently, and no one could take him away. I sat down at my laptop one evening after Oliver went to bed and opened my blog. I'd been writing about our experience for months, sharing updates as we went through the legal process. Thousands of people had followed along, commenting with support and sharing their own stories. Now it was time to write the final post. I titled it, Hope and Healing. I wrote about where we started, discovering Oliver was gone and fighting to get him back. I wrote about the legal battles and the fear and the trauma, but I focused the ending on recovery. On Oliver thriving with us. On the legal changes being proposed. On how we'd transform the worst experience of our lives into advocacy that could help other families. I wrote about choosing hope over anger. About healing being possible even after terrible trauma. About our family being whole and strong and looking forward to the future. I hit publish at midnight and went to bed. When I woke up the next morning, the comments section was full. Hundreds of messages from people who'd followed our journey. They said our story gave them courage. That seeing us fight and win made them believe they could fight too. Several people mentioned they were pursuing legal action against hospitals or family members because our experience showed them it was possible to get justice. One woman wrote that she'd reported her sister for keeping her baby after a similar mix-up, and the police had just returned her daughter. She said she wouldn't have had the courage without seeing us go public. Reading those comments made me cry. Good tears, healing tears. Our nightmare had meaning beyond just us. We'd helped people, changed things, made the world slightly better because we'd refused to give up. Oliver's first birthday party was small. Just our parents, my sister, Matt's brother, and 2 close friends. We didn't want a big celebration, just family who'd supported us through everything. I made a smash cake and set Oliver in his high chair with it. He looked at the cake suspiciously at first, then grabbed a handful and shoved it in his mouth. Chocolate everywhere, on his face, in his hair, all over his hands. Matt took about 50 photos while Oliver destroyed the cake. Everyone laughed watching him. Normal first birthday celebration for a normal, healthy baby. Except nothing about getting here had been normal. I looked around the room at the people who'd helped us survive. My mom who let us stay with her during the worst weeks. Matt's dad who helped pay legal bills. My sister who watched Christopher when we had court dates. Friends who brought meals and listened to us cry. We'd gotten through this because of them. Because we'd had support and resources and people who believed us. I thought about families who didn't have that. Who faced similar nightmares alone. That's why the advocacy mattered. Why speaking to the legislature and writing the blog and sharing our story was important. After cake, we opened presents. Toys and clothes and books for Oliver. He was more interested in the wrapping paper than the actual gifts. We laughed and took photos and celebrated our son. Looking at Oliver smashing his face into chocolate cake, I felt overwhelming gratitude. He was here, he was healthy, he was legally and permanently ours. We'd fought for him and won. Nothing could take that away. My therapy session that week was different. Elise started by asking how I'd been sleeping. I told her I'd slept through the night every night for 2 weeks straight. No nightmares, no panic attacks, no waking up to check Oliver's crib. She smiled and said that was significant progress. We talked about the birthday party and the blog post and how I was feeling about everything. I told her I still had bad days. Days when I saw a woman with a baby and felt a flash of fear. Days when I remembered those 2 weeks without Oliver and wanted to scream. But the bad days were fewer now. Outnumbered by good days. Days when I felt like a normal mom doing normal things. Elise said that was exactly what healing looked like. Not the absence of trauma, but learning to live with it. Learning to have more good days than bad ones. She suggested we transition to monthly sessions instead of weekly. That I'd made remarkable progress and didn't need intensive support anymore. The idea scared me a little. Weekly therapy had been my anchor through all of this, but it also felt like graduation. Proof that I was truly healing. That what Diane did to us wasn't defining every moment anymore. I agreed to monthly sessions starting next month. Elise said I could always call if I needed her between appointments, that she would be there if I had setbacks. But she believed I was strong enough now to manage with less support. Walking out of her office that day felt significant, like crossing a finish line I hadn't known I was running toward. Matt and I talked about having another baby one night after Oliver was asleep. We were lying in bed and he asked if I'd ever want to try again. The question brought up complicated feelings. Part of me wanted to give Oliver a sibling, wanted to experience pregnancy and birth the way it was supposed to be, without hospital mistakes and trauma. But another part of me was terrified. I didn't trust hospitals anymore. Didn't trust medical staff to keep my baby safe. The thought of going through labor and delivery again made my chest tight. Matt said he understood. That we didn't have to decide anything now. That we could wait as long as I needed. I said maybe in a year. Maybe after more time to heal. Maybe at a different hospital with better security protocols. We talked about using a hospital in another city. Somewhere that hadn't been involved in our nightmare. Somewhere that had implemented all the new safety measures. Matt said whatever I needed, whenever I was ready. That he was happy with our family exactly as it was. That Oliver was enough. But if I wanted another baby eventually, he would support that too. We decided to wait at least a year. Give ourselves time to fully process everything that happened. Time to feel secure and stable. Time to trust again. The conversation felt good. Like we were planning a future instead of just surviving the present. Like we were healing enough to imagine growing our family. Maybe someday. When I was ready. When the trauma wasn't so fresh. When I could walk into a hospital without panic. 3 weeks after Oliver's first birthday party, a thick envelope arrived in the mail with the logo of the organization we'd donated to. I opened it while Oliver played with blocks on the living room floor, and inside was a formal letter on heavy paper stock along with their annual report. The letter thanked us for our contribution, and explained that our donation had helped 12 families secure legal representation in custody battles over the past year. 12 families who might have lost their children because they couldn't afford lawyers. The report included brief summaries of each case, names redacted for privacy, but the situations were heartbreaking. A father fighting his ex-wife's parental kidnapping across state lines. A grandmother battling her drug-addicted daughter for custody of twin toddlers. A foster family trying to adopt the baby they'd cared for since birth when biological relatives suddenly appeared. Reading those stories made my chest tight because I remembered that panic, that terror of losing Oliver. But knowing our worst nightmare had funded legal help for 12 other families made the pain feel different somehow. Not gone, but useful. Like the money we'd received from the hospital settlement was doing something good in the world, instead of just sitting in our bank account reminding us of trauma. I folded the letter carefully and put it in the drawer where I kept important documents, then sat on the floor next to Oliver and helped him stack blocks until Matt got home from work. Oliver's 15-month checkup happened on a Tuesday morning, and I'd been dreading it for reasons I couldn't quite explain. Maybe because doctor's appointments still made me think of hospitals, of the NICU, of that terrible moment when I'd seen Diane holding my baby. But Oliver's pediatrician was kind and patient, and she'd been following his case since we'd gotten him back. She did the usual measurements, checked his reflexes, watched him walk around the exam room grabbing at everything within reach. Then she sat down with her clipboard and looked at me with this expression I couldn't read. She said Oliver was developing beautifully, hitting all his milestones right on schedule, and showed incredibly secure attachment to both Matt and me. She used that specific phrase, secure attachment, and explained that babies who experience disruption in their first weeks sometimes show signs of attachment issues later. But Oliver didn't. He was confident, curious, affectionate, exactly what a 15-month-old should be. She said we'd done an amazing job giving him a stable, loving foundation despite everything that happened. The professional validation hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so many nights worrying that those 2 weeks with Diane had damaged Oliver somehow, that he'd carry invisible scars from being separated from us. Hearing a pediatrician say he showed no signs of early trauma made me want to cry right there in the exam room. Instead, I just nodded and asked about his eating habits. But inside, I felt this huge wave of relief that maybe we'd actually protected him, that maybe we'd fought hard enough and fast enough that he wouldn't remember any of it. The grocery store incident happened completely by accident 3 weeks later. I was pushing the cart through the produce section with Oliver sitting in the front seat chewing on his teething ring when I heard someone say my name. I turned around and saw one of the nurses from the NICU, the younger one who'd been kind during those awful first days. She recognized me immediately and asked how Oliver was doing. For a second, I felt that old panic rising, the urge to grab my baby and run, but then it passed. I took a breath and told her he was great, growing like crazy, into everything. She smiled and said she'd thought about us so many times, wondered how things turned out. I gave her the short version, the court case and Diane's conviction, and Oliver coming home safe. She looked genuinely happy to hear it, said she was glad we'd gotten justice. We talked for maybe 5 minutes about normal things, Oliver's development and his favorite foods, and how he was starting to say a few words. Just a regular conversation between two people who happened to know each other. When she walked away, I stood there for a minute holding onto the cart, realizing I'd just talked about the NICU without having a panic attack. I'd discussed Oliver's early days with someone who'd been there without feeling like I was going to throw up or pass out. The calm conversation felt like proof that I was actually healing, that the trauma wasn't controlling every moment anymore. Matt surprised me 2 weeks later by booking a beach house for the weekend. He'd been planning it secretly, arranging coverage at work and packing bags without telling me until Friday morning. Oliver's first real vacation, first time away from home overnight. I felt anxious loading the car, checking and rechecking that we had everything, but Matt just smiled and said we'd figure it out if we forgot something. The drive took 3 hours with Oliver sleeping most of the way, and when we got to the beach house, it was small and perfect, right on the sand. That first afternoon, we took Oliver down to the water and he lost his mind with excitement. He'd never seen the ocean before, never felt sand between his toes. Matt held his hands while he splashed in the shallow waves, and I took about 100 photos on my phone. Watching Oliver laugh and play, completely unafraid and happy, I realized something had shifted inside me. I wasn't constantly scanning the beach for threats, wasn't imagining someone grabbing him and running, wasn't holding him so tight he couldn't move. I was just watching my son play in the sand like a normal mom on a normal vacation. The fear that had lived in my chest for over a year was still there, but quieter now. Manageable. I was learning to trust the world again, to believe that Oliver was safe and ours and nobody could take him away. That weekend felt like the first time I'd truly relaxed since he was born. The phone call from Ava came on a Tuesday afternoon while Oliver was napping. She said the state legislature had passed new hospital security requirements and stronger penalties for custodial interference, and they'd named the law after our case without using our actual names. The law required electronic wristband systems in all maternity wards, mandatory ID verification before any baby could be moved, and criminal penalties up to 10 years for anyone who knowingly kept a baby that wasn't theirs after being informed of the mistake. Ava said our case had been cited in committee hearings as an example of why these protections were necessary. I sat on the couch after hanging up, trying to process what that meant. Oliver's nightmare had led to legal changes that would protect other families. Other babies wouldn't be given to the wrong mothers. Other parents wouldn't spend weeks fighting to get their children back. The law couldn't undo what happened to us, couldn't give back those 2 weeks I'd lost with Oliver. But it meant something. It meant his story had a lasting impact beyond just our family. That night, I told Matt about the law and we looked up the news coverage online. Several articles mentioned our case without naming us, describing the hospital mix-up and Diane's refusal to return Oliver. Reading about it felt surreal, like reading about someone else's life, but also validating. The system had failed us, but now the system was changing because of what we'd survived. The letter from the hospital came 2 weeks later, formal and typed on official letterhead. They were forming a patient safety advisory board and wanted to invite me to join as a community representative. The position would involve quarterly meetings to review hospital policies and safety protocols, with a particular focus on maternity ward procedures. They were offering a small stipend for my time and expertise. I read the letter 3 times before showing it to Matt. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to never step foot in that hospital again, to have nothing to do with the place that had caused so much pain. But another part of me saw the opportunity. I could use what happened to us to prevent other families from experiencing the same nightmare. I could advocate for better systems and stronger protections. I could turn my trauma into expertise that actually shaped hospital policy. Matt said it was completely my choice, that he'd support whatever I decided. I thought about it for 2 days before calling the hospital administrator and accepting the position. My first meeting was scheduled for the following month, and I felt nervous but also powerful. Like I was taking back control of the narrative, using my lived experience to create change. The hospital had taken so much from us, but now I was going to make sure they did better. Oliver's first word happened on a Sunday morning while I was making breakfast. Matt was playing with him on the living room floor, building towers with blocks so Oliver could knock them down. I heard Matt laugh and then call my name, his voice high and excited. I ran into the living room and Matt pointed at Oliver, who looked up at me with those bright eyes and said it again. "Mama, clear as anything. Mama." I scooped him up and spun him around, laughing and crying at the same time, kissing his face while he giggled. Matt grabbed his phone and started recording, capturing me holding Oliver and crying happy tears. That night after Oliver was asleep, we watched the video together on the couch, Matt's arm around my shoulders. We marveled at how far we'd come from those dark days when I didn't know if I'd ever get to be Oliver's mother, when Diane was calling him Christopher and posting photos like he belonged to her. Now here he was, saying Mama, knowing exactly who I was. The video became one of my most precious possessions, proof that we'd survived and won and built this beautiful life together. Oliver was 17 months old when I finally felt ready to look forward instead of backward. He was walking confidently now, saying a dozen words, laughing at everything, thriving in ways that still made me tear up sometimes. Matt and I were stronger too, our relationship deeper after everything we'd fought through together. The scars from what Diane did remained, visible in my hypervigilance about Oliver's safety and my distrust of hospitals, and the way I still sometimes woke up in the middle of the night needing to check that he was in his crib. But the scars were part of our story now, proof that we'd fought through institutional failures and legal battles, and Diane's calculated cruelty to protect our son. We'd won. Our family was whole. Oliver would never remember those 2 weeks with Diane, would never know the terror of almost losing his parents. He'd grow up knowing only love and safety and the fierce devotion of parents who'd moved heaven and earth to bring him home. Looking at him playing with his toys, babbling to himself in that language only toddlers speak, I felt overwhelming gratitude. Not for what we'd survived, but for what we'd built on the other side of it. We were finally able to plan for the future without trauma hanging over every moment, to imagine Oliver's second birthday and preschool and all the normal milestones ahead. The nightmare was over, truly over, and what remained was just us, our family, intact and healing and moving forward together.